Hi everyone, and welcome to your last online lecture, and your last lecture in general for this class. It's really only going to be essentially a half lecture, and what we're going to go through is some future directions for the field of criminology. Basically some areas where new research is being done and some important questions that are on the horizon to be answered in our field. So, as a discipline, criminology is still fairly young. I mean, when you think about the fact that the first book about criminology was written in the 20th century, should tell you that we still have a long way to go before we become a discipline that is as established as something like sociology or psychology. Many people still really consider it a subset of sociology. The very fact that this course is being taught within a sociology department should kind of tell you that. But some people would argue that it's important for the field to break itself free from being kind of a subsidiary in other departments and really emerge as a discipline of its own because criminology is something that is multidisciplinary. That's something that we talked about all the way at the beginning of the class. People who write in the field of criminology often are trained in a variety of fields. Some people would consider themselves sociologists. Some people approach things from much more of a psychological standpoint. Some people economical. So if you think about what we've learned so far, think about some potential areas where crim theory could go in the near future. I have a couple that I've kind of thought of and people have been buzzing about for the past couple years that we will talk about now. So the first area that I think criminology is going to have to address is the changing nature of social networks in this country, and not necessarily changing in terms of who people network with, but how they network with people socially. So think about all of those social process theories that we went through in this class. Things like social disorganization theory, social learning theory, all of these things that we would argue really the causal factors have to do with our social selves. Well, most of those social process theories involved some kind of direct face-to-face contact or involvement with the causal elements at hand. So, for something like social control theory, Hershey's original social control theory, that had to do with direct face-to-face involvement with your family. Something like social learning theory, it's all about your peers, your friends. Social disorganization theory, it's about your involvement in your neighborhood. But the key here is that all of those things are you having direct face to face, tactile interactions with these forces throughout your day. And if there's anything that we know about the changing nature of social networks, it's the fact that people aren't only networking and interacting with people face to face anymore. Social networking is moving online. It's moving to the internet and social media, um, many different ways that people network that don't have anything to do with just face to face contact anymore. And if you think about it, we don't know yet what the role of things like Facebook and Twitter and, I don't know, dating websites, things like that. We don't know yet what those social networking systems are going to do in terms of strengthening, weakening, widening people's social networks. We just don't know whether or not those changes are going to have an impact on crime. So, there's a lot of different ways that social networks are changing that we should consider. First of all, people have a lot greater mobility in general now than they ever did before. It used to be the case that your social network was fairly limited to the people that you lived around, your neighborhood, the few blocks around you, especially if you were a young person. That's really changing. Most cities, most big urban areas now have a lot of public transit. People have the ability to go throughout their city and network and come into contact and meet people in a way that they never did before. We also know that people are maintaining friendships and family connections through online sources now. It's not just you going to see your parents or your friends from high school. It's networking with them online and keeping up with them even though you might not have that much day-to-day, you know, vocal or interpersonal contact with them. And we also know that people are just on a daily basis interacting much more with their peers than they ever did. You guys are growing up in an era where you all have emails, you all have cell phones, usually almost everyone now is moving to, some kind of a smartphone where you can text message. I mean, it's kind of hard to believe probably for you guys now, but a very short time ago, that stuff just wasn't used a whole lot, and people went and saw each other, and if they needed to say something, they would, pick up the phone. And my point is, we don't know yet what any of these changing forces in social networking are doing to criminal activity. In other words, it kind of begs the question, are people who are in more contact with each other all day, are they going to commit more crime? Or is the distance that we're putting in between ourselves and people that we still kind of call our friends something that's limiting that person's influence on us, limiting that person's ability to exert some kind of control or force over us? It's a really interesting thing to think about, and it's something that criminologists are going to have to address because social networks are moving to online electronic resources. Another area that criminologists, has been a really hot topic for the past several years, has been addressing the fact that there is a new majority minority population in this country, or at least there very soon will be. Estimates from the past two census records have shown that the Latino population in this country is going to replace the African American population as the largest racial ethnic minority in the U.S. very, very soon. The most recent census put the estimate somewhere around 2030. So this is very much within your adult lives. And the question is, if this is the new majority minority group, are they going to begin to show similar crime rates as other minority groups? In other words, for now, we know that the Latino population isn't committing necessarily as much crime as African Americans, even though they tend to be living in fairly similar conditions, similar parts of cities. They tend to cluster together in kind of a similar way, but they don't commit as much crime yet. And many people argue that they're going to as their numbers grow and as they as their roots to their former country loosen even more. Now, the problem with that, first of all, it's obviously a problem if a community is predicted to have an increase in crime over the next several years. But another problem comes up in relation to what we call the racial threat hypothesis. The idea being, if you're a minority population, something like a Latino population, and you are present in a neighborhood that is largely white, for example, for the most part, the white population isn't going to feel threatened by you as a group until you reach a certain percentage. In other words, if you live in a community, let's say a middle class urban neighborhood, and it's for most of its history, it's been 80% white, 15% black, 5% other. Think about it that way. Well, as the Latino population has grown, it's gotten to the point where some of these neighborhoods are becoming much more 60-40, 50-50. And the question is, one thing that we know from observing neighborhood change and observing these population trends is the former majority population, once they start to actually feel threatened, once that percentage starts to get to a danger point, we call it, there starts to be much more discrimination, hate crimes, much more violence, interracial violence. And so the question, as it pertains to the Latino population, is, will this growing Latino population spark more discrimination? In other words, have they kind of been flying under the radar in a lot of neighborhoods because people don't perceive them to be a large enough group yet? But if that changes very soon, is crime going to change as a result of it in places that they occupy? Another thing to think about with this new majority-minority situation, the fact that Latinos are very soon going to overtake African Americans as the major minority population, has to do with Latino presence in urban neighborhoods. One thing that we know, and I had you guys read the Sampson New York Times article to kind of introduce you to this, we know that crime is very different in urban Latino neighborhoods from other low socioeconomic status areas. In other words, neighborhoods that are very dense populations of Latinos have much lower crime than similar conditions, other low SES areas with other minorities present. And that sparked a lot of interest with criminologists. We want to know why this group of people who are also a minority, who are also disadvantaged, aren't committing crime at the same level as other people in similar situations. And it all kind of comes back to the fact that for a lot of this neighborhood level um, research and theory in criminology, we're relying on the historical path of social disorganization theory. We're relying on updates and developments to that theory, which was based on, if you remember, think all the way back to Sean McKay in Chicago. Social disorganization theory was based on the patterns and the activities of 19th century, early 20th century immigrants who were, for the most part, from Europe. The question is, the majority of people who are coming into this country now aren't always Western Europeans. They're coming from a variety. A lot more people are coming in from Africa, South America, Asia, Latin America. And the question is, does that old theory that was based on that type of immigrants, those type of immigrants, still apply to modern immigration patterns? It might be the case that people immigrating from very different parts of the world simply behave differently than what this original theory was based upon. Another area that has become a developing area of interest in criminology, and especially criminology and criminal justice, has to do with the development of what we call risk assessment tools in the field. So think back to some of the different people who have talked about the fact that there are a small percentage of people out there who tend to be responsible for a large percentage of the crime. We also talked about it in terms of places, that there tend to be small places responsible for most of the crime. Um, you should think back to somebody like Wolfgang 6%. That's the kind of idea we're talking about here. Well, one of the suggestions as a way to kind of decrease the incarceration population and become better at only putting the most serious people into prison is to try to design what people are calling a risk assessment tool. In other words, designing some kind of a tool so that we could actually try to predict who this 6% is based on them entering the system. So what criminologists and criminal justice scholars are trying to do is they're trying to design a tool that ideally correctional facilities, correctional programs could use, so that when somebody comes into the system, an offender comes into the system with a certain number of risk factors, a certain number of background history information, that the correctional officers could actually try to assess their future risk so that you could predict which people are likely to be committing crime, even if they go to prison. Which people are the 6% and which people are only sporadic, occasional, not that serious offenders. Well, if we did this, let's say we could design an intervention tool like this, a risk assessment tool that was somewhat accurate at predicting the people who are likely to be chronic long-term offenders and the people who are likely to peter out and desist fairly early in adulthood. If we could design that, and some people have tried to do this, the question still remains, what should we actually do with that information? Should we target those people and give them a lot of prevention and early intervention programs to try to help them not become one of this small percentage of chronic offenders? Or should we selectively incapacitate these people? Idea being, somebody who comes in who looks a lot like a life course persistent offender, for example. Even if they haven't committed a ton of offenses yet, if they look in all ways, by this tool, like they will be somebody who commits crime their whole lives, should we selectively incapacitate them, put them in prison to physically prohibit them from committing crime in the future? Well, that's a really difficult question to answer. I mean, when you think about it, it's hypothetically locking people up for offenses they haven't committed yet. It's offenses that we feel reasonably confident that they will commit. But it really kind of toes the line in terms of constitutional rights, civil rights, and a lot of people are talking about this as a necessary tool that we need to lower the incarceration rate, to only put these, serial, serious offenders into prison. But it's something for you guys to think about, those of you who maybe want to go into corrections, criminal justice. This is going to come up for you guys. They have designed they've designed a working, up and running risk assessment tool in Virginia that they're using right now. And it'll be an interesting thing to think about for you, whether or not you buy that we can actually assess people's risk accurately. And even if we can, whether or not we should try to help them or just try to put them away. And the reason that this risk assessment tool has become such a big issue is really this fourth area. and it's an area that has an incredible amount of attention. I've told you this a couple times. The reentry population is a big hot topic right now, and there is a growing number of criminologists out there who very strongly believe that we need to, as a country, undergo some kind of a decarceration project. So if you take a look at the United States incarceration rate, all the way back from the 1800s up to 2008, not no surprise if I asked you guys to interpret a graph like this. What you should understand is, starting in the early 1970s, we saw an exponential increase in the amount of people we were incarcerating in this country. We incarcerate more people now than we ever have in our history. In terms of rate, this is not, obviously the raw numbers are always going to be more, but per 100,000 people in this country, we incarcerate a huge number of people. And things like the California program I told you about, where the Supreme Court came in to mandate releases, that's one example of something that is going to continue to happen if states all over the country don't make a concerted effort to decarcerate, to find other ways to punish and deal with people who are committing crime than just sticking them in prison. So, the question to think about, and again, if we were in class, we would try to discuss this, but the question to think about is, how are we actually going to make the number of people in prison manageable again? Again, not a simple question. You can't just let people out. There are, public safety issues, there are political issues, citizens, the residents of these states have to have some kind of a say in what goes on here. Very difficult things for states to actually try to achieve. And as you guys saw in the example from California, even states that have been mandated to decarcerate aren't exactly doing it in a way that maybe was intended. The Supreme Court mandated the state of California to release 40,000 people. And if you remember back from that lecture, they're not really releasing these people. They're just kind of rerouting them, finding new places to put them. That's not what the decarceration movement is about. The decarceration movement is about finding alternative punishment methods, things that will keep people in the community that genuinely don't need to be incarcerated based on their offenses. And it's very hard to think about for us, for your generation, for my generation, because we were brought up in an era where we just incarcerated hundreds and hundreds of people, more per 100,000 than we ever did before. But it begs the question, if we were able to do this for the better part of 2 centuries, why can't we try to go back to at least some kind of a more manageable rate? Okay, well, that's about it for this semester, for this lecture. I hope that you enjoyed the online portion of the class. Please continue to fill out the brief survey, giving me your thoughts, opinions, suggestions for possibly having this class be a hybrid or fully online class in the future. Thank you for a great semester. You guys did a really good job. For those of you especially who it was your first hybrid course, I thought everybody really did a great job adjusting. And have a wonderful summer. And congratulations to our seniors and people who are graduating this semester.